It has been 365 days since World War III ended. The world you knew is gone. Cities are ashes. Governments are silent. And I might be one of the last survivors on Earth. The first thing I remember was the sound of the sirens. Not the usual emergency alarms you hear during a storm warning. These were different. Louder. Longer. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands why. I was in my apartment when it started. At first I thought it was some kind of drill. Governments run drills all the time. But when I looked outside the window, I saw people already running through the streets. Cars were speeding past, horns blaring, people shouting. Something was very wrong. I grabbed my phone and opened the news. Every channel was broadcasting the same message. Multiple missile launches detected. Possible nuclear strikes. Citizens are advised to seek shelter immediately. For a moment I just stood there staring at the screen, trying to process the words. Nuclear strikes. World War III had begun. My heart started racing. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Outside, the sirens kept screaming across the city like the sound of the world ending. People were panicking now. Some were trying to leave the city. Others were rushing into buildings, subway stations, basements, anywhere they thought might protect them. But deep down everyone knew the truth. If the missiles were really coming, there was nowhere to run. I threw a backpack together as fast as I could. A flashlight, a knife, a few bottles of water, some canned food. It felt pointless, but doing something was better than standing there waiting. The television behind me suddenly cut to a military broadcast. A map appeared on the screen covered with red markers. Dozens of them. Missile trajectories. My city was directly in the path of one. My chest felt tight as if the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. I didn't think anymore. I just moved. Down the stairs. Out the building. Into the street. Chaos. Cars were crashing into each other. People were screaming. Some were crying, calling loved ones on their phones, trying to say goodbye before the networks collapsed. Above us, the sky was perfectly clear. Too calm. Too normal. I started running toward the old Cold War bunker near the industrial district. It had been abandoned for decades, but I remembered hearing about it years ago. At the time it sounded like a useless relic from another era. Now it was my only chance. The ground shook as something exploded somewhere far away. Not a nuclear blast. Not yet. But close enough to remind everyone what was coming. As I ran, I saw something in the sky. At first it looked like a tiny star moving across the blue. Then another one appeared. And another. Missiles. Dozens of them streaking across the atmosphere like silent spears. Somewhere on the other side of the world, other people were seeing the same thing, heading toward them. The bunker entrance finally came into view, half hidden behind a rusted metal fence. A few other people had the same idea. They were already trying to force the heavy steel door open. We pushed together, panic giving us strength. Finally, with a horrible metallic scream, the door moved. One by one we rushed inside. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was the sky. And the bright flash on the horizon. That was the moment the world ended. For a long time after the door closed, nobody spoke. We just stood there in the darkness, breathing heavily, listening to the silence of the bunker. Then the ground shook. At first it was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the earth. The concrete walls trembled slightly. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. Someone whispered, "That was it." Another explosion followed. Then another. And another. Each one stronger than the last. The bunker lights flickered once before going out completely. The emergency lamps kicked in, filling the corridor with a dim red glow that made everything look like a nightmare. No one had to explain what was happening above us. The missiles had arrived. Somewhere far above our heads, entire cities were being erased in seconds. Millions of people who had been living their normal lives only minutes earlier were now gone. The shockwaves rolled through the ground like waves through the ocean. Boom, boom, boom. Every explosion echoed through the bunker like a giant hammer striking the earth. Some people started crying. One man dropped to his knees and covered his ears, screaming for it to stop. A woman sat against the wall holding a photo of her family, whispering their names over and over again. I just stood there, frozen, trying to imagine what was happening outside. How many bombs? How many countries? How much of the world was burning right now? The explosions lasted for what felt like forever. Maybe an hour. Maybe less. Time stopped making sense in that underground tomb. Eventually the rumbling faded. The silence that followed was even worse. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt like the entire planet had stopped breathing. We spent the first night inside the bunker trying to understand our situation. There were 9 of us. 9 strangers hiding underground while the world ended above us. The bunker was old, built during the Cold War, but surprisingly solid. Thick concrete walls, steel blast doors, a few emergency generators that still worked if we rationed the fuel. There were also old storage rooms. Most of them empty. But one room still had supplies left behind decades ago. Canned food, bottled water, medical kits, old military blankets. Not much, but enough to survive for a while. The biggest problem was the radiation. We didn't know how bad it was outside. One of the men, an older guy named Victor, had once served in the army. He remembered some things about nuclear fallout. After the explosions, he said quietly, the radioactive dust starts falling. Like snow. Nobody liked the sound of that. If we go outside too early, he continued, we won't last long. So we waited. Day 1 passed in fear. Day 2 passed in silence. By the 3rd day, the bunker felt like a prison. People were arguing now. Some wanted to leave immediately. Others said it was suicide. The air felt heavier with every hour. Finally we made a decision. We would open the door. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see what remained of the world. 4 of us volunteered to go to the entrance. I was one of them. The massive steel door groaned as we slowly turned the wheel. Every sound echoed through the corridor. The final lock released with a loud metallic click. For a moment, nobody moved. Then we pushed. The door opened just a few inches. Gray light spilled into the bunker. Not sunlight. Something darker. Something wrong. I stepped forward carefully and looked outside. The sky was black. Not night. Smoke. The entire horizon was burning. Ruined buildings stretched across the landscape like broken skeletons. Fires still raged everywhere, sending thick columns of ash into the air. Cars were overturned. Streets were cracked open. The city I had known my entire life was gone. Completely destroyed. And the wind carried something else through the silent ruins. Ash. Millions of tiny gray flakes drifting slowly down from the sky. Nuclear fallout. The firestorm had only just begun. By the 7th day, the bunker no longer felt like safety. It felt like a cage. The air had grown stale despite the old ventilation system still struggling to push fresh air through the pipes. The emergency lights cast the same dull red glow across the concrete walls, turning every face into something pale and exhausted. None of us were sleeping well anymore. Every sound echoed through the bunker: the hum of the generator, the distant creaking of metal, the quiet breathing of the others trying to rest. And every time the ground vibrated slightly, everyone froze, afraid another bomb had fallen somewhere nearby. But nothing else came. The war, it seemed, had ended as suddenly as it began. Or maybe there was simply no one left to keep fighting. Victor kept repeating the same thing. Fallout is the real danger now. He had explained it to us on the second day while we sat around one of the old storage tables. When nuclear weapons explode, he said, they throw radioactive dust high into the atmosphere. That dust falls back to the ground slowly. Like snow. Deadly snow. According to Victor, the worst radiation usually came in the first few days. But the danger didn't disappear completely. Some areas would stay poisoned for years. Maybe longer. The thought of stepping outside into that invisible death made my stomach twist. But we couldn't stay underground forever. Our food was limited. Our water was limited. And the bunker wasn't designed for long-term survival. On the morning of the 7th day, we made the decision. We would go outside, carefully, slowly, only for a short time. We used whatever we could find in the bunker to protect ourselves. Old military raincoats, cloth masks, gloves. It wasn't real radiation protection, but it was better than nothing. The steel door groaned as we opened it again. This time we stepped outside. The world looked even worse than before. The sky was still covered by thick gray clouds of smoke and ash, blocking most of the sunlight. The air smelled like burned metal and chemicals. Everything was silent. No birds. No distant traffic. No voices. The only sound was the wind pushing ash across the empty streets. I walked slowly forward, my boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The city looked like it had been bombed 100 times. Entire buildings had collapsed into piles of twisted steel and concrete. Windows were shattered everywhere. Cars sat abandoned in the streets, some burned down to black metal skeletons. It was impossible to imagine how many people had died here. Thousands. Maybe millions. One of the others pointed toward the horizon. A massive column of dark smoke still rose in the distance where the industrial district used to be. That part of the city had taken a direct hit. We stayed outside for only 15 minutes. But during that time we saw something that none of us expected. Movement. At the far end of the street, between two destroyed apartment blocks, a figure appeared. A man. He moved slowly, carefully stepping over rubble just like we were. For a moment we just stared at each other across the ruined street. Another survivor. Proof that we weren't alone in this dead world. The man looked thin, dirty. His clothes were torn and covered in ash. But he was alive. He raised one hand slightly, as if unsure whether to greet us, or run. Then he spoke, his voice rough and dry. "You came from the bunker too, didn't you?" Before anyone could answer, a loud cracking sound echoed somewhere nearby. All of us turned at the same time. One of the damaged buildings across the street began to shift. The upper floors, already weakened by the blast, were finally giving way. Concrete started falling, glass shattered, and within seconds the entire structure collapsed in a thunder of dust and rubble. When the cloud cleared, the man was gone. buried somewhere under the ruins. We stood there in silence. That was the moment we truly understood something. Surviving the bombs had only been the beginning. Now we had to survive the world that remained. By the 14th day, the bunker was no longer an option. Our food was running low, and the tension between everyone inside had grown worse with each passing day. Living underground with strangers, surrounded by silence and fear, had started to break people. We all knew the truth. If we wanted to survive long term, we had to leave. The surface might have been dangerous, but staying in the bunker meant slowly starving. So that morning we packed everything we could carry. Canned food, bottled water, flashlights, tools, old blankets from the storage room. 9 people had entered the bunker on the first day. Now 8 of us were leaving. The man who died under the collapsing building was a reminder of how fragile survival had become. Victor stood by the door and looked at each of us. "We move carefully," he said. "Stay together. If we see heavy fallout areas, we turn around." Nobody argued. We opened the bunker door one last time. Cold wind pushed through the entrance, carrying the smell of burned metal and dust. The sky above was still dark gray, though faint sunlight was finally starting to break through the thick clouds of ash. For the first time since the war began, the world looked slightly brighter. But the destruction was still everywhere. The city looked like a ghost. Burned cars sat abandoned in the middle of the streets. Entire buildings had collapsed, blocking many of the roads with mountains of concrete and twisted steel. Ash covered everything. It crunched beneath our boots like dirty snow. We moved slowly through the ruins, avoiding unstable buildings and piles of debris that could shift at any moment. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much to say. Every corner of the city held memories. Places where people had once lived normal lives. Restaurants, offices, schools. Now they were empty shells. About an hour into our walk, we reached one of the main highways leaving the city. Or at least what used to be a highway. The road was completely jammed with cars. Hundreds of them. Some had crashed into each other during the panic. Others had simply been abandoned by people trying to escape before the missiles arrived. Many of the vehicles were burned black. Some were flipped over. A few still had their doors hanging open, as if the drivers had jumped out at the last second and run. The scene looked frozen in time. A monument to the final moments before the world collapsed. We carefully climbed between the vehicles, searching for anything useful. One of the women found a half-full bottle of water inside a car. Another person discovered a small toolbox. Every little thing mattered now. As we continued moving along the highway, Victor suddenly raised his hand. "Stop." Everyone froze. At first I didn't understand why. Then I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones. They crossed the dusty road between the cars and disappeared into the countryside beyond the highway. Someone had passed through here recently. Another survivor. Or maybe a group. The discovery made everyone nervous. Meeting other survivors could mean help. But it could also mean danger. Without laws or governments, people could become desperate. Desperate people did terrible things. We followed the footprints for a short distance before they vanished into the wind-blown ash. Victor looked toward the horizon. "People are out there," he said quietly. The highway stretched forward into the countryside. No traffic, no lights, no signs of civilization, just empty road disappearing into a gray, silent world. For the first time since leaving the bunker, we realized something terrifying. The city was gone. And now we were walking into the unknown. The road ahead felt endless. But turning back wasn't an option anymore. So we kept walking. 30 days. An entire month had passed since the missiles fell. And the world was still silent. Our group had been traveling for more than 2 weeks now, following highways, back roads, and sometimes nothing more than broken paths through fields and forests. We moved carefully, always avoiding large cities or industrial areas where the radiation might still be stronger. The further we walked, the more we understood something terrifying. The war hadn't just destroyed cities. It had erased civilization itself. We hadn't seen a single working vehicle since leaving the bunker. Every car we found was abandoned or destroyed. Gas stations were empty shells with broken windows and looted shelves. Power lines hung uselessly above the roads. No electricity, no signals. Phones had become nothing more than dead pieces of plastic in our pockets. The internet was gone. The governments were gone. The world we had known was over. We spent most nights hiding inside empty houses or small farms we found along the countryside. Sometimes we were lucky and found canned food left behind by families who had fled too quickly to take everything. Other times we survived on almost nothing. But hunger wasn't the worst part. The silence was. No airplanes. No distant cities glowing at night. No music. No voices on the radio. Just wind moving through empty buildings and the sound of our own footsteps. One afternoon, about a month after the war began, we reached a small town. Or what was left of it. Unlike the city, this place hadn't been directly hit by a bomb. Most of the buildings were still standing, though many windows were broken and doors hung open. The streets were empty, completely empty. We walked slowly between the houses, checking for supplies. A grocery store near the town square had already been looted, but we still managed to find a few cans hidden under collapsed shelves. It felt strange walking through a place where life had once been normal. Children had played here. People had gone to work. Neighbors had talked in the streets. Now the only thing left was dust and silence. Then we heard something. A sound none of us had heard since before the war. A dog barking. Everyone froze. The sound echoed somewhere between the houses. Another bark followed. Alive. Something was still alive here. We carefully moved toward the noise. Behind one of the houses we found it. A thin brown dog chained to a wooden post. It looked weak, but when it saw us it started barking and wagging its tail wildly. The poor animal must have been left behind when its owners fled. One of the women in our group slowly approached it and gave it some water from a bottle. The dog drank desperately. None of us said anything for a moment. Because that small moment reminded us of something we had almost forgotten. Life still existed in this broken world. We decided to take the dog with us. It wasn't much, but having another living creature nearby made the empty roads feel a little less lonely. That night we slept inside one of the houses. For the first time in weeks, the silence of the world was broken by something comforting. The soft breathing of the dog curled up near the door. But sometime during the night, the dog suddenly began growling. Low, aggressive, its ears pointed toward the street outside. Then we heard it too. Footsteps. More than one person, moving slowly through the town. We weren't alone here after all. And whoever was outside hadn't announced themselves. The dog's growling woke everyone instantly. In the world before the war, footsteps outside at night wouldn't have meant much. Maybe a neighbor walking home. maybe someone passing by. But now every unknown sound meant danger. We sat up in the darkness, listening. The footsteps outside the house were slow and careful. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through the town. They were searching. Another step, then another. Wood creaked somewhere outside as someone walked across a porch. The dog's growl became louder. Quiet, Victor whispered, gently holding the dog by its collar. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then a beam of light suddenly swept across the broken window. A flashlight. Someone was checking inside the house. My heart started pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. A voice came from outside. "Looks empty." Another voice answered from somewhere down the street. "Check the next one." The footsteps slowly moved away. We waited in silence for several minutes, afraid they might come back. Finally Victor spoke quietly. "Scavengers." That word had become common in the New World. People moving from place to place searching through ruins for food, water, or anything valuable. Some scavengers were harmless. Others were not. In a world without laws, people could become dangerous very quickly. We waited nearly an hour before anyone relaxed again. But nobody slept after that. At first light, we carefully looked outside. The town streets were still empty. But fresh footprints covered the dusty road. At least 4 people had moved through the area during the night. And they had been armed. We could tell by the shell casings lying near the road. Someone had fired a weapon recently. That discovery made our decision easy. It was time to leave the town. We packed our supplies quickly and started moving again, heading deeper into the countryside. The dog followed closely beside us, occasionally sniffing the air as if it could still sense the strangers who had passed through the night before. Hours later we reached a small forest area where the road narrowed between tall trees. That was when we saw them. 3 figures standing in the middle of the road. They hadn't tried to hide. They were waiting for us. All 3 were men. Dirty clothes, heavy backpacks, and rifles. Real rifles. One of them raised his hand slightly as we approached. "Relax," he said. "We're not here to start trouble." Nobody in our group lowered their guard. In the old world, seeing armed strangers like this would have been alarming. In this new world, it was almost expected. Victor stepped slightly in front of us. "What do you want?" The man shrugged. "Same thing everyone wants now. Food, water, information." For a long moment both groups just stood there studying each other. Everyone was tired. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was trying to decide whether the people in front of them were a threat, or the closest thing to allies left in this broken world. Then the man spoke again. "There's a larger group about 2 days north of here," he said. "They've taken over an old military checkpoint." He pointed down the road behind them. "They say it's safe." Nobody in our group said anything. Safe. That word felt strange now. Almost impossible. But in a world this empty, even the smallest sign of organized survivors could mean hope. Or a trap, and we had no way of knowing which one it was. 90 days after the war began, the world had become something new. Something harder. Something more dangerous. Our group had followed the 3 armed men north for 2 days, just like they said. None of us fully trusted them, but traveling alone in a dead world felt even more dangerous. At least with more people, there was a chance to defend ourselves. The road eventually led us to what used to be a military checkpoint near the border of 2 regions. Before the war, It had probably been nothing more than a small security station for traffic inspections. Now it looked like a fortress. Concrete barriers had been dragged across the road. Burned vehicles formed a crude wall on both sides. Someone had even set up a watchtower using an old truck and metal scaffolding. And there were people everywhere. At least 20 survivors lived there. Men and women, some armed with rifles, others working to repair shelters built from tents, tarps, and pieces of broken buildings. It wasn't a city, but it was the closest thing to a community we had seen since the bombs fell. For the first time in months, it almost felt like hope. They allowed us to stay after checking our supplies and weapons. In the new world, trust had become a rare and valuable thing. Everyone had to earn it. Life at the checkpoint was simple but organized. A few people stood guard day and night watching the road. Others searched nearby areas for supplies. Food was shared carefully so nothing would be wasted. The dog quickly became popular with the children who lived there. Seeing kids laugh again felt strange. Like a memory from another life. For a few weeks, things were almost peaceful. But peace in the new world never lasted long. One evening, just before sunset, the lookout in the tower shouted. "Vehicles!" Everyone rushed toward the barricades. Far down the road, several trucks were approaching through the dust. At first some people felt relief. Vehicles meant fuel. Fuel meant power. Maybe more survivors. But as the trucks got closer, something felt wrong. They were moving fast. Too fast. And they weren't slowing down. Then the first gunshot echoed across the road. The bullet smashed into one of the metal barriers with a loud clang. "Raiders!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted instantly. People grabbed weapons. Others rushed to pull children and supplies behind the barricades. The trucks roared forward, engines screaming. Men stood in the back of the vehicles firing rifles wildly toward the checkpoint. Bullets tore through wood and metal. Glass exploded everywhere. The peaceful survivor camp had turned into a battlefield in seconds. Victor grabbed my arm. "Get down." More gunfire ripped through the air. One of the defenders near the barricade fired back, his rifle cracking loudly. The raiders didn't stop. Their trucks slammed into the outer barriers, sending debris flying across the road. A man jumped from the back of one vehicle holding a shotgun and started running toward the camp. These weren't survivors looking for help. They were predators. In the broken world after World War III, groups like this had started appearing everywhere. Armed bands who survived by stealing from others. Sometimes worse. The battle lasted only a few minutes. But it felt like hours. Gunshots echoed through the ruined checkpoint while dust and smoke filled the air. Finally, the raiders realized the defenders weren't going to break easily. One of the trucks reversed quickly while the others turned around. Within seconds they were speeding away down the road, disappearing into the gray horizon. The silence that followed was heavy. 2 people from the checkpoint had been injured. One of them badly. The message was clear. Even in a place that felt safe, danger was always waiting. And the world outside the barricades had become far more violent than anyone had imagined. By the 120th day, we had learned a terrifying truth. The world after World War III wasn't just dangerous because of other humans. It was dangerous because of the land itself. Victor called them the dead zones. Areas so heavily irradiated that nothing lived there anymore. No plants, no animals, no insects, nothing. Just ash, dust, and ruined soil. We were heading east now, following a faint river we hoped would lead us to safer lands. The survivors at the checkpoint had warned us. The river is contaminated in parts, one of them said. Don't drink it unless you've boiled it. And stay out of the plains nearby. Too many dead zones left behind. We didn't argue. The road was empty except for the occasional burned car or collapsed building. But as we moved further from the checkpoint, the world began to change. The trees became thin and blackened. Grass turned gray. Rivers were no longer flowing freely. Patches of land were covered in a thick, white powder that glittered strangely in the weak sunlight. I remembered Victor's words. Some areas will never recover. We soon reached the first true dead zone. It stretched for miles in every direction. Buildings had crumbled into ash. Cars were nothing more than skeletons of metal. The air smelled bitter, like chemicals mixed with smoke. Even the wind felt sharp against your skin, as if it could cut. We put on whatever makeshift protection we had. Masks, scarves, gloves. Then we entered carefully. The ground crunched beneath our boots. Small animals that might have scurried here before were gone. Only silence. Victor led the way, moving slowly, scanning everything. Radiation can't be seen, he warned. But it can kill in minutes if you're careless. We only stayed a few minutes inside the worst area, but those minutes felt endless. Every step we took made the world feel more alien. Even the dogs seemed cautious, sniffing the air nervously and refusing to venture too far. At one point, we stumbled across a house half buried in ash. Its windows were blackened. Inside, everything had rotted. Food long decayed. Furniture crumbled into dust. And on the walls, marks left by people who had tried to survive, scratches, words carved in desperation, even crude warnings about the radiation. We didn't stay long. The moment we left the house, a strange wind picked up. Ash swirled violently, stinging our eyes and throat. It felt as though the dead zone itself was alive, pushing us out. Hours later, when we finally reached land that wasn't completely poisoned, we collapsed under the weak sunlight. The air outside the dead zone smelled normal. For a moment, it felt like relief. But deep down, everyone knew this. The war had changed the world forever. Some places were completely gone. And for every safe-looking patch, there might be another dead zone waiting just beyond the horizon. Surviving wasn't just about finding food or avoiding raiders anymore. It was about knowing where to step, and knowing which places were best left untouched. By the 150th day, we had traveled hundreds of kilometers through a world that had become unrecognizable. The dead zones were behind us, but every step forward reminded us that danger was never far. Food was running low again. Supplies were scarce, and the constant vigilance against raiders had left everyone on edge. Victor spotted it first. A faint trail through the trees leading up a hill. At the top, partially hidden by overgrowth and debris, stood what looked like an old military base. The structure was enormous, concrete and steel, with several watchtowers still intact. Most of the fencing was damaged, but the gates had clearly been reinforced. Signs of previous inhabitants were everywhere, makeshift barricades, footprints, and the remnants of old supplies. This could be what we need, Victor whispered. Shelter, maybe weapons, anything that can help us survive longer. We approached cautiously. The wind whispered through the broken buildings, carrying the smell of rust and decay. The first gate had been forced open, likely decades ago, but it still offered some protection. Inside, the base was eerily silent. Rooms that might have once stored munitions were now mostly empty. Rusted crates, broken radios, and dusty uniforms littered the floor. Yet, as we explored further, we found pockets of usable equipment, old rifles with a few rounds left, bandages, tools, and cans of preserved food tucked away behind a collapsed wall. For the first time in months, it felt like we had a small victory. We set up a temporary camp inside the largest building. It wasn't luxurious, but the thick walls would protect us from both raiders and radiation. The dog curled up in the corner, clearly approving. That night, as we huddled around a small makeshift fire, Victor spoke quietly. Places like this, they were abandoned for a reason. Military bases are targets in war. The people who were here probably didn't leave voluntarily. Some may have died, or worse. We all sat in silence, considering his words. The reality was clear. Anywhere that seemed safe could quickly become a trap. The following day, while scavenging more of the base, we discovered a small underground bunker beneath the main building. The metal door was heavy, but it opened with surprising ease. Inside, we found maps, old radios, and even a few intact emergency rations. This was more than shelter. This was information. Maps of the surrounding regions showed roads, rivers, and areas that might still be safe. Victor studied them carefully, tracing routes with his finger. This could change everything, he said. If we plan carefully, we might actually have a chance to survive, and maybe even rebuild something. But the base wasn't completely empty. As the sun set, we heard faint noises from one of the outer towers, shuffling footsteps, whispers. Raiders. Another group of survivors. Or something else entirely. For the first time in months, we realized something important. Survival wasn't just about avoiding danger. It was about preparing for it. And this base, while a temporary haven, was only the beginning of a much larger fight for life in a world gone silent. By the 200th day, life at the military base had begun to feel like a fragile balance. We had claimed the main buildings, scavenged what supplies we could, and fortified the perimeter. For a while, it seemed almost safe. Almost normal. But the world had other plans. On the morning of the 200th day, the dog growled. Low, tense, and warning. At first, I didn't hear anything over the wind. Then I saw it. A small drone hovering above one of the ruined watchtowers. Its propellers slicing through the ash-filled air. Not a human threat. Not a raider. A machine. The base had old automated security systems, drones, turrets, and sensors, all designed decades ago to protect it from intruders. We hadn't expected any of it to still work. The drone buzzed closer, scanning us. Victor waved his arms, trying to get it to move away. Nothing. It recorded, analyzed, and sent signals to something we couldn't see. Automated security, Victor muttered. Some of these systems still function. We need to be careful. We spent the next few hours cautiously exploring the perimeter. A pair of turrets sat on either side of the main gate, still armed with rounds, their targeting sensors occasionally flashing red. One wrong move, and they could have killed us. The presence of the machines added a new layer of tension. No longer was survival only about raiders or radiation. Now, the base itself could become a threat. We decided to disable the turrets temporarily, using wires and tools from the supply room. It took hours. Every click and spark felt like walking on a knife's edge. One wrong connection, and the turret might activate. By nightfall, We had managed to turn off most of the active systems. But the drone still hovered overhead, its sensors sweeping over the ruins. Victor pointed toward the horizon. "These machines aren't dangerous by choice," he said. "But they don't know mercy. They protect this place the same way humans would, only faster and without hesitation." The realization sank in. The world wasn't only filled with dead zones, raiders, and abandoned cities. It was filled with remnants of the old world that no longer cared about human life. Machines, left to their own devices, continued to watch, defend, and occasionally punish intruders. As night fell, we sat huddled inside the main building. The drone's red eye glowed faintly through a broken window. The dog whimpered softly but refused to leave my side. We had food, shelter, maps, knowledge, but the lesson of the day was clear. In a world gone silent, survival meant more than strength, cunning, and luck. It meant understanding that some dangers weren't human, and that the tools of the old world could be as deadly as the war itself. By the 250th day, the world had begun reminding us that survival wasn't just about raiders, radiation, or old machines. Nature had a new plan. It started slowly. At first, small gusts of wind whipped ash across the base, rattling windows and sending loose debris flying. The survivors shrugged it off, thinking it was just another reminder of the post-war chaos. But then the winds grew stronger. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, thicker and more oppressive than anything we had seen before. Lightning streaked across the gray sky, briefly illuminating the ruins of the old world. Victor stared at the approaching storm, frowning. "Radiation isn't the only thing left behind," he muttered. "The planet's still angry. Storms, earthquakes, everything's out of balance now." By mid-afternoon, the storm hit. Wind howled through the broken gates and collapsed towers, carrying a mixture of ash, dust, and debris. Trees bent violently, and the dog whimpered as it pressed against my leg. Rain fell in blackened sheets, soaked with chemical residue from burned cities and dead zones. We huddled inside the main building, blocking doors and windows as best as we could. Some of the weaker structures around the base collapsed under the force of the wind. Lightning struck nearby trees, sending sparks across the frozen ground. One tree fell just outside the base, smashing into the outer barricade. Even the old military drones, silent for months, suddenly activated. Their sensors detected the storm as a threat and started moving on their own, patrolling the damaged areas. Victor shouted over the wind, "Stay away from the towers. The drones might mistake you for intruders." The storm raged for hours. It tore through the surrounding forests and hills, washing ash into the river and turning the muddy paths into rivers of black sludge. By nightfall, the survivors were exhausted. Everyone was soaked, chilled, and shaken. Food and water were barely enough to sustain us after the chaos. But the worst part wasn't the storm itself. It was the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The world had been pushed to the edge. The war had destroyed its balance. Radiation, abandoned machines, raiders, and storms, they were all symptoms of a planet trying to reset itself. We huddled together that night, the dog pressed between us, as the wind continued to howl outside. And for the first time in over 8 months, I realized something terrifying. The world wasn't just silent. It was alive, and it had no mercy left for the weak. 300 days after the war, the world was no longer recognizable. Every step forward reminded us of what had been lost. Cities were rubble, forests were poisoned, and even the rivers carried ash. But some things remained, shadows of the past that refused to disappear. We had left the storm behind and were following an old highway toward what Victor hoped would be safer lands. The landscape was littered with reminders of the world before. Broken billboards, rusting vehicles, empty playgrounds frozen in time. A Ferris wheel leaned to one side, its metal frame twisted and creaking in the wind. At first, it seemed harmless, just remnants. But as we moved deeper into the abandoned suburbs, we realized these shadows carried stories. Dark stories. In a burned-out house, we found a diary. Pages blackened and brittle, but still legible in parts. The entries told of people who had tried to survive after the first bomb. Families hiding in basements, scavenging for food, watching neighbors vanish one by one. Some of the words were frantic. Others resigned. The last entry ended with a single sentence. If anyone finds this, the world is gone. We are gone. The weight of that sentence pressed down on all of us. Further down the street, we found abandoned vehicles with notes scratched into the paint. Messages for those who might come after. Warnings, names, dates. Some desperate pleas, some bitter curses. The dog sniffed around, clearly disturbed by the sense of loss lingering in these places. Victor motioned for us to move quietly. "These are ghosts," he said. "Not just the dead, but the memory of how we failed before. Places like this, they can haunt you if you linger too long." We continued cautiously. Every house, every empty street told a story of survival and failure. By dusk, we came across a small underground shelter that seemed intact. A family had lived here at the start of the war, leaving supplies, toys, and a few personal items behind. Nothing could replace the people who had once used it. But we took what we needed, food, water, and blankets, and left quietly, as if respecting the lives that had ended there. The shadows of the past were everywhere. They reminded us that survival wasn't just about hunger or raiders or radiation. It was about memory, about remembering what had been lost, and deciding what we could carry forward. That night, as we set up camp under a half-collapsed warehouse, the dog curled up beside me. We were alive. But the world we walked through was haunted, and the echoes of the past whispered warnings that the future could be just as cruel. 330 days after the war, the world had grown stranger, harsher, and more dangerous. We had left the shadows of the past behind and stumbled upon something new. A massive industrial complex, its smokestacks broken and windows shattered. Locals might have called it a factory, but now it was just a hollow skeleton of steel and concrete. The place loomed over the surrounding landscape, its shadow stretching across the ash-covered fields. Victor stopped at the edge of the complex. "This could be a gold mine, or a death trap," he said. Everything inside could either help us survive, or kill us. We approached cautiously. The air smelled of rust, oil, and decay. Every step echoed loudly in the empty corridors. Inside, machinery stood frozen in time. Conveyor belts were covered in dust. Control panels were cracked and corroded. Some areas had collapsed entirely, leaving gaping holes in the floors. Despite the decay, we found pockets of resources. A small storage room held boxes of canned food, powdered milk, and bottled water. Old generators could still be repaired. Tools and spare parts lay scattered across the floor. It felt like a treasure trove after months of scavenging the ruined world. But the factory had a danger all its own. Automated machinery, still partially powered by backup generators, roared to life without warning. Conveyor belts spun wildly, crushing debris. Rusted robotic arms moved unpredictably, knocking over steel beams. Victor led us through a narrow corridor, ducking under swinging machinery. "Watch everything," he warned. "Even a single mistake here could be fatal." The dog followed cautiously, avoiding the moving parts with surprising agility. Hours later, we found a control room. The screens were cracked, but some flickered weakly. Old maps of supply routes and factory schematics were still visible. Victor's eyes lit up. "This is perfect," he said. "We can learn how this place worked, maybe use it to our advantage. Even build something that lasts." But as night fell, the factory revealed another threat. From deep inside, we heard noises, clangs, scraping metal, and something heavy moving across the upper floors. Not machines. Someone, or something, was still inside. Our group armed themselves cautiously, knowing that raiders, desperate survivors, or worse could be hiding. The factory was a resource, yes. But in a world gone silent, nothing was ever free. And as we huddled together in a small office, listening to the strange sounds echoing through the vast building, we realized something terrifying. The factory wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting to test whether we could survive its traps, its dangers, and the unknown intruders that still haunted its halls. 350 days after the war, hope felt like a distant memory. But sometimes, even in the darkest world, it could appear in the smallest, most unexpected ways. After surviving the dangers of the silent factory, we pushed forward, guided by Victor's maps and instinct. Supplies were low, but the promise of a safe place kept us moving. The landscape began to change. The ash thinned. Trees started showing faint traces of green. The rivers were clearer, though still slow and dark. Signs of life, however fragile, were beginning to re-emerge. Then we saw them, smoke rising in the distance. Not black, not chemical. White, clean smoke. Victor squinted. "That's human-made," he said quietly. "Someone's alive, and they're building something." As we approached cautiously, we saw the first real signs of civilization in nearly a year. Tents, small wooden buildings, fenced areas. People moving with purpose. Children running and laughing. For the first time, the dog barked excitedly, tugging at its leash. We were met at the edge of the settlement by two men carrying rifles. Their expressions were cautious but not hostile. "Who are you?" one asked. "Travelers," Victor said, "looking for a safe place." The men studied us for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, they lowered their weapons. "Come inside," one said. "You're not the first to arrive here, but you could be the last before winter. Follow me." Inside the settlement, we were greeted by families, elders, and children. They had food, water, and shelter. Most importantly, they had structure. Rules. Organization. It wasn't perfect, but it was life. Victor spoke with the leaders, learning their routines, their defenses, and their small victories. They had cleared dead zones nearby, reclaimed farmland, and even set up a basic communications system using old radios. It was more than survival. It was rebuilding. As the sun set over the settlement, the sky no longer seemed entirely gray. Small fires glowed warmly. Laughter echoed faintly. For the first time in nearly a year, the weight on our shoulders lifted. We had survived the bombs, the dead zones, raiders, storms, and abandoned machines. And now, maybe, just maybe, we could start living again. Victor turned to us, a rare smile on his face. This isn't the end, he said. It's the beginning. 365 days. One full year had passed since the world ended. The bombs had fallen, the dead zones had claimed entire landscapes, raiders had stalked the roads, storms had raged, and machines had continued their cold, indifferent patrols. And yet, we were still here. The settlement we had found 30 days ago was small, fragile, and vulnerable, but it was alive. Children laughed. People worked together. Crops were planted in reclaimed fields. Fires burned warmly in the evenings, and for the first time in over a year, sleep didn't feel like a gamble with death. I walked through the settlement with the dog at my side. Victor was speaking with the leaders about expanding defenses. Others repaired buildings, fortified walls, and shared stories of the days before the war. The world was gone, but life, somehow, stubbornly, continued. We gathered that evening for a small ceremony. Nothing grand, just a quiet recognition of what we had survived. Victor spoke first. A year ago, this world ended. Today, we are still here. That means something. It means we can keep going. It means hope is possible. The dog barked softly, and even that tiny sound seemed like applause. I looked around. Faces tired, scarred, but alive. People who had seen death and destruction and somehow found a way to keep moving forward. The diary we had found months ago, the one filled with despair and warnings, felt different now. The past had been lost. The world had been destroyed. But the future, maybe, just maybe, we could build it. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like a canvas. A world destroyed could still be remade. I looked at the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ruined lands we had crossed. Ash still covered the ground. Empty cities still waited to be explored. Dead zones still claimed patches of earth. But life persisted, and that was enough. 1 year after World War III, the world was gone. But we remained. And maybe that was the most important thing of all. And that's how we survived 365 days after World War III. A full year in a world gone silent, where hope was the only thing left to fight for. If you enjoyed following our journey through the ruins, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to join us on the next adventure. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new survival story. And leave a comment below. What would you do if you were surviving a year in a world like this? Stay alive, stay prepared, and I'll see you in the next chapter.